If someone announced at the height of the Cold War that on a desolate African wilderness with no running water or power grids, he would beat the United States and the Soviet Union and be the first to send humans to Mars, you would probably take it as an absurd joke. Even more ridiculous was that his so-called space capsule was nothing but a rusty discarded oil drum. To train astronauts, he would put a 16-year-old girl inside the drum and push it hard down a slope, letting her tumble through dirt and struggle with violent nausea to experience what he called space weightlessness. Back then, nearly all major Western newspapers across the globe put his name on their most humorous pages. With condescending words, they mocked him as an ignorant madman and an international laughingstock who brought disgrace to the newly independent African nation. The elderly man who defied Earth's gravity with the crudest tools amid widespread scorn and ridicule was Edward Makuka Nkoloso, the founder of Zambia's space program in the 1960s. Tonight, let the flickering fireplace keep you company as we explore his life through this story. Dry encyclopedic records label Edward Makuka Nkoloso as an amateur science fiction enthusiast lacking basic scientific knowledge. His Afro Space Agency never managed to launch a single object off the ground. Yet if we set aside colonial arrogance and prejudice in the quiet of the night, and turn our eyes to Zambia's red land, newly liberated but trapped in poverty, we will realize there was no madman here at all. He was an intellectual who survived the brutal World War and witnessed the enslavement of his people. Amid the vast spiritual ruins of the post-colonial era, he nurtured a bloom of romanticism, lonely, surreal, and tender. His seemingly ridiculous persistence was a spiritual breakthrough. With empty oil drums and simple swings, he delivered a tragic yet dignified declaration of self-respect for people of African descent. Now let the thunder of the Cold War arms race fade away. Following the soft, cool breeze sweeping across the Zambian wilderness, we picture the aged figure shining a flashlight toward the starry sky all alone in the dark night. To understand what others deemed his senseless craziness, we need to rewind to October 1964, a month that sent tremors across the entire African continent. Zambia officially gained its independence. After decades of British colonial rule receded like a tide, the nation was left with great emptiness and confusion behind the celebrations. New national flags fluttered along the streets, and locals danced around bonfires all night long. Yet at that time, Zambia had fewer than 100 university graduates nationwide, and its industrial base was as fragile as a sheet of paper ready to tear. Edward Makuka Nkoloso was in his prime then. He had a lean, angular face and a neat mustache, his eyes holding a complex blend of military restraint and literary melancholy. Conscripted into the British colonial army, he fought in World War II. Amid the muddy jungles of Southeast Asia, he watched the so-called civilization boasted by European colonial powers crumble under artillery fire. The advanced warplanes roaring overhead and heavy artillery capable of flattening cities filled him with awe, yet also left a deep wound of inferiority and grievance in his heart. He kept asking himself, why were such powers always held by white people? Why could his compatriots only toil deep in copper mines, trading their flesh and blood for meager coins? When the salute of independence rang out, Makuka stood on the edge of the cheering crowd. Instead of gazing at the newly built government buildings, he looked up at the vast, profound African starry sky, a realm never truly occupied by colonizers. He came to see that political independence was only a beginning. If the newly born Zambia could not prove its presence to the world in spirit and cutting-edge technology, its independence would be nothing but an illusion. Without applying for government approval or receiving any funding, he set up a weathered wooden sign reading Zambia Academy of Science, Higher Education and Research on a desolate farm outside Lusaka. And so, his grand space program quietly began. If you drove past the wilderness outside Lusaka in the spring of 1965, you might have thought you had stumbled upon a bizarre Halloween stage. Beneath a towering solitary baobab tree stood Edward Makuka Nkoloso. Dressed in a faded yet neatly pressed old British military uniform, he faced a group of young people with solemn dignity. These were Zambia's first generation of astronauts he had recruited, mostly landless wanderers and teenagers lost about their future. With an almost religious solemnity, Makuka handed out clumsy space suits stitched from coarse burlap. In a deep, calm voice, he unfolded his ambitious blueprint of interstellar travel. Lacking real aerospace equipment, he turned to extraordinary yet heartbreaking imagination and resourcefulness. He bought several large empty oil drums from scrap yards, scrawling, Zambia D. Kalu, 1 rocket, on them with rough white paint. These became his only simulated spacecraft. To help trainees adapt to space conditions, he asked a 16-year-old girl named Makuka to climb into one drum, then had young men push it down the dusty slope. Every time the drum hit a rock with a heavy thud, every time the girl screamed and vomited inside, Makuka stood on the hilltop clutching his old notebook. There was no trace of amusement on his face, only profound and even ruthless concentration. He also built a tall swing with thick ropes and planks under the baobab tree, making the trainees swing violently to break free from the invisible pull of Earth's gravity. Under the scorching African sun, the wilderness echoed with the creak of wooden planks, the heavy panting of young people and the rumble of rolling oil drums. To Western journalists with cameras, this scene was nothing more than exotic farce and international ridicule. But for Makuka, every crude action was a lonely struggle, a desperate effort to dig his way out of the spiritual cage of backwardness. Edward Makuka Nkoloso was not a man cut off from the world. He knew exactly what his plan lacked, not just technology, but also global attention for his country. Thus the self-appointed head of the space agency embarked on a surreal journey of political outreach and fundraising. Using a borrowed worn typewriter, he wrote countless letters day after day to the United Nations, NASA and even Khrushchev of the Soviet Union. His words were sincere and proud. In those lengthy letters, he detailed his plans to send black astronauts to the moon. He also spoke to the United States and the Soviet Union as an equal, warning them not to carry out colonial expansion in space. Zambian astronauts, he declared, would stand watch as messengers of peace. To secure the 700 million British pounds needed for space exploration, he repeatedly marched dozens of kilometers in his signature military uniform, waiting silently outside foreign embassies in Zambia. Standing before grand marble buildings cooled by air conditioning, he looked like a stranger from another era, holding scrolls filled with bold ideas. He was met with cold rejections from guards and evasive, mocking glances from diplomats. Sometimes he would sit in shabby taverns in downtown Lusaka, buying cheap local beer to share with truck drivers and street vendors. He told them tales of strange long-eared creatures living on Mars. His tone was firm and gentle, and even those trapped in poverty and illness would catch a glimmer of dream in their eyes as they listened to stories of the stars. Yet the coldness of the outside world was heavier than he had imagined. Western media widely reported his story, but every word and photograph portrayed the newly independent African nation as foolish and immature. Sitting in his mud hut lit only by kerosene, Makuka stared at newspapers carrying deliberately distorted photos of himself. He did not fly into a rage, but sank into long silence. His neat mustache trembled slightly in the shadows, as if he were bearing the immense loneliness imposed by his times all by himself. What awaits most idealists is rarely a dramatic downfall, but a slow, quiet decline into oblivion. By the late 1960s, when Apollo 11 set the first human footprint on the moon and the whole world celebrated this giant leap for mankind, Makuka's African space program inevitably came to an end. His young trainees left first. The hunger and hardship of real life proved far more compelling than distant Mars. Makuka, the 16-year-old girl who had tumbled inside oil drums countless times and held his high hopes, packed her simple belongings one night and left the farm with a passing truck driver. She chose to marry and live an ordinary life with enough food to eat, no longer needing to fight against gravity. Other young people departed one after another in the dead of night, leaving their burlap space suits to rot and tear in wind and sand. In the end, the farm that once bore grand slogans was left with only Edward Makuka Nkoloso, together with several empty oil drums gradually rusting and overgrown with weeds across the wilderness. Makuka was already advanced in years. His face grew gaunter, and years of exposure to wind and sand clouded his once clear eyes with weariness. The Zambian government began to see him as a liability to the national image, excluding him from official independence celebrations. He was no longer a focus for the media. The Western journalists who once came for novelty never returned, and the wilderness fell back into its age-old silence. Still, the stubborn old man refused to bow his proud head. On countless moonless nights, he put on his tattered military uniform and walked slowly to the great baobab tree. He sat on a half-rotted wooden swing, staying quiet in the darkness. Listening to insects chirping in the grass, he strained his dim eyes toward the twinkling night sky, as if waiting for a spaceship that would never land to take away this lonely wanderer lost on Earth. Edward Makuka Nkoloso passed away peacefully on an ordinary morning in 1989, in a shabby small house provided by government relief. There were no flowers or medals beside his bed, only stacks of yellowed letters drafted to appeal to the United Nations, their handwriting blurred by time, and a flattened miniature rocket crudely cut from an aluminum can. Even after his death, people would still smile condescendingly when talking about him, referring to him as the Zambian madman who tried to reach the moon with oil drums, a bizarre anecdote for casual chat. But the gentlest side of history often reveals itself only to peaceful souls after all the commotion fades away. Do we truly have the right to mock Edward Makuka Nkoloso? During the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union pointed intercontinental missiles at each other and humanity faced the threat of nuclear destruction at any moment, this elderly man in poverty-stricken African land devoted his whole life to calling for peace and healing the national inferiority complex with dreams. Who, then, was the real mad one? He never lifted a single inch off the ground, yet with a lifetime of absurdity and solitude, he paved the most romantic imaginary road toward the stars for the weak and the forgotten across the post-colonial spiritual wasteland. The story has come to an end. The desolate red land outside Lusaka, the baobab tree swaying in the breeze, and the space dream fading away inside rusty oil drums have settled gently in your mind. Only the faint fire continues to burn softly and quietly through the night. The elderly man who gazed at the stars all his life and was misunderstood as a madman by the whole world has long broken free from Earth's heavy gravity, turning into a faint yet free star high up in the night sky. Tonight, you have walked through this romantic epic spanning half a century alongside his persistent, tragic journey. Close your eyes. Let this soothing narration calm all your worries about right and wrong, gain and loss. Drift slowly into a peaceful dream, free from colonial prejudice and poverty, where endless stars wrap the African wilderness in tender light. Wish you a sound sleep.